In 1800s Japan, the idea of celebrating Christmas was about as common as finding a samurai in a Santa hat, which is to say, not common at all, but very fun to picture. Imagine a solemn warlord gently placing a porcelain snowflake on a bonsai tree, then hiding the ornament behind his sleeve with a sigh, lest anyone question his festive spirit. Officially, Japan had been a bit allergic to Christianity for a good while by this point. After all, since the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate had decided that foreign missionaries were more trouble than mistletoe and cracked down on Christianity with the enthusiasm of a cat knocking ornaments off a shelf. Foreign belief systems, particularly those arriving with European traders, were perceived as sneaky conduits for colonial influence, sort of religious Trojan horses, but with fewer horses and more Jesuits. So by the 1800s, even whispering about Jesus could earn you a very cold reception, possibly an eternal one. But history, like mulled wine, works best when you let it warm over time. In 1853, a man named Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay with a fleet of black ships, a bold stare, and basically said, "Hello, we're the United States, and we'd like to open up trade now, thanks." Japan, who had been rather fond of its 2-century-long nap from most foreign influence, blinked slowly and started warming up to the idea of the outside world again, sort of like when you finally re-download a social media app just to check one thing, and 15 minutes later, you're watching a raccoon make pancakes. Christian missionaries began trickling back in, particularly in the 1870s, as Japan transformed under the Meiji Restoration, an era when the country decided to stop being a feudal drama and instead become a rapidly modernizing nation-state with trains, telegrams, and eventually twinkly lights. Christmas was initially viewed the way one might investigate a particularly stylish but unfamiliar pair of boots, with curiosity, caution, and the occasional deep bow. It wasn't celebrated publicly right away, but traces began to appear in coastal cities like Yokohama and Nagasaki, where Western merchants and diplomats brought their customs, their pudding recipes, and their slightly alarming beards. Early Japanese Christmases were not religious. They were, well, mostly a decorative showcase with cake. Christianity remained a minority religion, but the aesthetic appeal of Christmas, evergreens, bells, candles, and the charming notion of giving someone socks in a box began to catch on among a small segment of Japanese urban society. By the 1880s, department stores in Tokyo and Yokohama started tentatively hanging up Christmas decorations, not because people were suddenly dramaturgically invested in the nativity story, but because shiny things sell very well. There's something delightfully universal, it turns out, about human beings seeing a sparkly ornament and thinking, "Ah yes, I absolutely need 12 of these." Children were introduced to something quite new and quite sugar-based, Christmas cake, a strawberry frosted sponge cake, soft and sweet, light enough to float on a whisper. Nothing says cross-cultural holiday adoption quite like recreating a centuries-old European feast as a deliciously moist chiffon delicacy, eaten quietly under electric lights. You could say Japan took the Western concept of Christmas, gave it a bow, made it taste better, and removed most of the theology. What remained was a quiet season of gift-giving, gentle lights, and tentative traditions, swirling gently through the winter air like snow that never quite hits the ground. And yet, back in the early 1800s, when these customs first peeked curiously into Japanese life, such a spectacle would have seemed as foreign as putting pickled daikon under the tree and calling it a stocking stuffer. Next to Buddhist and Shinto traditions with centuries-deep roots, this red and green phenomenon with its imported holly and jolly must have shimmered like a distant dream, one only slightly interrupted by the practical consideration of finding a fir tree on a crowded island archipelago, mostly populated by pines, cedars, and a whole lot of skepticism. Still, dreams have a way of settling in quietly, like snow on a silent roof in Kyoto, and soon, even the silence would begin to hum with distant sleigh bells, softly, softly, so as not to disturb the neighbors. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. As the twilight of the 1700s curled into the quiet dawn of the 19th century, Japan was still cozily nestled inside its self-imposed bubble, the Sakoku policy, closed country, intact like a quilt wrapped snugly around the islands, shielding them from the drafty winds of foreign influence. In short, Japan was about as interested in Santa Claus as a napping cat is in learning French. Foreign contact was scarce and heavily monitored. A few select merchants from the Dutch East India Company rubbed shoulders with Japanese officials down in Nagasaki's Dejima, a fan-shaped artificial island where commerce and curiosity bumped elbows with caution. It was a fragile arrangement, like balancing soup on a sword. Safe, as long as no one sneezed. Now, if you wandered into Edo in the early 1800s, modern-day Tokyo, you'd find a bustling city where the clack of gaiter sandals mingled with the hush of shoji doors, and the wisdom of haiku floated gently from one bamboo grove to another. But what you wouldn't find, not even with a telescope, was a Christmas tree. Back then, the idea of Jesus Christ was considered the sort of thing best left locked in a Portuguese history book. Christianity had been banned since the early 1600s. After a few too many, missionaries got a little too enthusiastic. You see, the Tokugawa shogunate didn't mind trade, as long as it didn't come packaged with religious zeal or unsolicited hymnals. Christianity was seen less like a peaceful gospel and more like an invasive species, like inviting a rabbit into your garden and waking up to find it's taken over the property and held elections. So Christmas, being kind of the gala event of Christianity, was persona non grata. There were no twinkling lights, no jingling bells, no one urging you to buy 3 kimonos and get the 4th for free by the fireside. December 25th was just December 25th, a perfectly ordinary winter day, suitable for poetry, sober, and wondering if Mount Fuji would make an excellent metaphor for your fleeting romantic insecurities. And yet, things have a way of sneaking through the cracks of stone walls, like whispers under a Fuzuma door, or tinsel in your ramen. Even though the vast majority of Japanese citizens had never even heard of Christmas, let alone experienced it, tiny echoes of it did exist, particularly in Nagasaki, that little portal to the outside world. There, Dutch traders sometimes observed their own low-key Christmas traditions. It wasn't a full-on jingle extravaganza with candy canes and carols, more like a private toast to the baby Jesus with a splash of brandy and a subtle comment about the fish being slightly overcooked. The Dutch were permitted to live on Dejima, but they were also prohibited from spreading Christianity, so you can imagine Christmas cheer being swapped in quiet nods and whispered greetings, as though it were contraband, sort of like illicit mistletoe smuggling. Scholars and translators kept careful watch, as Japanese interpreters who dealt with Dutch merchants also doubled as cultural gatekeepers. They were the samurai of semantics, deciphering imports without letting too much foreign merriment spill beyond the barriers. Still, records from the time suggest that some Japanese citizens, particularly learned ones and those interested in rangaku, or Dutch learning, began to piece together a faint idea of foreign holidays through scraps of books, illustrations, and awkwardly translated texts. One Edo period scholar is even said to have referred to Christmas as the Western Day of Silent Winter Reverence, which, oddly enough, makes it sound remarkably peaceful, as if he too might have benefited from a good fruitcake and a long nap. Though perhaps not in that order. There were no Santas yet, no sleighs, no reindeer crash landing on pagoda rooftops, but the snow did fall all the same. Winter in Japan was still draped in soft silence, with steam curling up from miso soup bowls and woodblock prints catching every hush of nature's breath. The season may have lacked stockings and angels, but it had poetry and snowfall and the occasional cabbage accidentally shaped like a bell. And that, in a modest way, was enough. As the island nation slumbered under frost and stillness, the faint perfume of cinnamon, imagined or otherwise, might have drifted unnoticed into a scholar's study or swirled around a curious trader's memory of home. Invisibly, like a ghost of holiday past, waiting for history to give it breath. But change, like presence, has a funny way of showing up, often wrapped in ships, accentuated by diplomacy and flavored with cross-cultural misunderstandings. And soon, all that seasonal slumber would be nudged gently awake by a knock at the gate, firm, foreign, and wearing shoes. Nestled between the smoky tendrils of an Edo period winter and the quiet clatter of gaiter sandals tapping cobbled streets, 1800s Japan was, shall we say, delightfully unaware of Christmas. In fact, if you'd wandered into a village in the shadow of Mount Fuji and asked for chestnuts roasting on an open fire, they might have handed you a bowl of simmered daikon and reminded you politely not to loiter near the hearth. You see, the entire notion of December 25th as a day of tinsel-tangled celebration was, in Japan at that time, as relevant as moon boots or microwave popcorn. It simply wasn't a thing. Christianity had been banned for over 2 centuries, following the early Tokugawa shogunate's nope not today attitude toward Western influence and anything that smelled like missionary work, or actual missionaries, who had a reputation for showing up unannounced, bearing crosses and theological complexity. After a few 17th century kerfuffles, known in the scholarly community as religious uprisings, but which probably included a fair amount of dramatic finger-pointing and flinging of poorly translated scripture, the government got very serious about keeping Christianity out. Like, take it underground or deal with samurai serious. So any whispers of Christmas, or anything even faintly resembling it, got buried deeper than a snow-covered path in Hakodate. And yet, humans being humans, the holiday spirit has a way of seeping in, eventually. But here, in this sleepy juncture of the 1800s, Christmas in Japan was still very much a candle flickering behind a sliding shoji screen, distant, unfamiliar, and more likely associated with stern-faced import inspectors than with eggnog. Still, you might wonder, what was winter like for folks of that era, if not filled with carols and compulsive gift wrapping? Imagine a town of woodblock charm, where merchant stalls bristled with dried persimmons, fishermen mended their nets with mittened fingers, and housewives used ingenuity, not Amazon Prime, to prepare for the cold. Winter festivals did exist. It wasn't total austerity, but they weren't red and green affairs with elves tap dancing across confectionery rooftops. Rather, they followed the rhythms of the sun, the moon, and rice harvests. Events with vaguely poetic names like Little New Year or Drunken Good Fortune, provided you don't fall into the well. People huddled in their homes around sunken hearths known as irori, where mochi sizzled gently on wire grates as food offerings were made to household deities who, in a highly relatable twist, were often just local spirits trying to do their best and not anger the neighbors. There were lucky charms, straw decorations, and the occasional rice straw Shinto ornament hanging above doorways. Not mistletoe, mind you, but the thought was in the same decorating family. Hang something odd near your entrance in hopes of pleasing someone powerful. And if you ever needed a reminder that time is more circular than it seems, the Japanese winter solstice traditions involve bathing with yuzu citrus, essentially taking a slightly tangy bath to ward off evil and colds. Not so different in theory from our own endless supply of vitamin C flavored holiday concoctions, though with significantly more fragrance and significantly fewer seasonal jingles piped through Bluetooth speakers. Now, should a time-traveling European trader have stumbled into a Japanese village during one of these snow-dusted Decembers, he'd likely be greeted with a civil bow, a bowl of miso, and not even the foggiest acknowledgement of Rudolph or his 9-pointed colleagues. Picture him standing baffled in his weathered boots, clutching a fruitcake no one asked for, while a local elder politely explains that, no, St. Nicholas is not on the Kami roster this winter, or any winter. But the whispers were beginning. Steamships had already begun to pout in Yokohama Bay by the mid-1800s, their foreign passengers anxiously awaiting customs inspection and perhaps the right moment to introduce plum pudding. And a change was coming, slow as melting snow, subtle as a hint of cinnamon in a pot of iron-rich tea. Japan's frosty December evenings would not stay entirely untouched forever. There were men with waistcoats and mission statements. There were illustrated publications with jingling sleigh bells masquerading as cultural literacy. And sooner or later, someone with a gramophone and a Santa Claus print was going to show up. But for now, the air was filled with wood smoke, the warmth of fish broth, and the subtle rustling of bamboo in a garden that knew nothing of tinsel. As the fire crackles and the snowy rooftops yawn toward the stars, let us drift a little further into this curious landscape, where the calendar year is turning, but the Christmas carol remains unsung. A new kind of December waits quietly ahead. If we close our eyes and tiptoe into the frosted memories of 19th century Japan, we'd find ourselves in a curious place. A country itself standing on the edge between centuries-old isolation and the creeping, steam-powered fingers of the West. And if we listened closely, past the rustle of kimono silk and the crisp crunch of gravel under gaita, we might even hear the faintest jingle, not of sleigh bells, but of something much odder. Peculiar customs were beginning to land like snowflakes, quiet, cold, and occasionally perplexing. Now, to be clear, Christmas in 1800s Japan wasn't exactly Christmas. Not in the way tinsel-tangled department stores or cocoa-fueled caroling nights would like you to believe. No, before Japan fully opened its ports in the mid-1800s, the nation had been mostly sealed off for over 2 centuries under the Tokugawa shogunate's Sakoku policy, which, roughly translated, means absolutely no Western nonsense, unless you're Dutch and very polite. And so, for quite a long time, the only Europeans getting a glimpse of Mount Fuji were the Dutch traders tightly corralled on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki. They weren't allowed to teach the Japanese about Santa Claus or decorate pine trees or explain what exactly a figgy pudding was. although, to be fair, few outside of England could do that with confidence anyway. But despite those strict borders, curiosity is a persistent creature. Like an insistent raccoon at a picnic, Western culture kept nudging its clever little paws into Japan's tightly packed bento box. By the 1850s, Commodore Perry rolled into Edo Bay with his famously coercive fleet of black ships, and with the polite subtlety of a brass band during nap time, Japan's gates were pried open, which meant that at long last, Christmas began its odd, slow, almost accidental migration into the Japanese consciousness. Now imagine poor Christmas arriving like a timid foreign exchange student with no luggage, no language skills, and a complete misunderstanding of appropriate customs. One of its first introductions. A party thrown by none other than the Meiji-Era elite, ever eager to impress their Western guests with how spectacularly modern and non-samurai they'd become. Tea was served, British of course. Cake was cut, preferably spongy and decorated with cream, and someone, possibly in a tailor-made kimono trimmed with lace, attempted a rendition of Silent Night, in German. But that's jumping ahead a bit. Back in the earlier part of the century, when Christmas was still trying to figure out what to wear in Japan, one of its rare appearances was in the quiet company of foreign missionaries. Mostly French and Portuguese, they tiptoed around the country under suspicious eyes, teaching Christianity behind closed screens and attempting, in hushed tones, to explain why December 25th involves so many farm animals, stars, and surprise gifts from mystical home invaders. These small Christian enclaves, considered illegal and largely underground, were like the snowflakes before the blizzard. Secret masses were held in candlelit rooms behind rice paper screens, hymns sung in a mix of Latin and very confused Japanese, and nativity stories passed along as whispered tales. Baby Jesus, for some, must have seemed not unlike a character from kabuki theatre, surrounded by animals, miracles, and a somewhat bewildering plot. Outside the missionary circles, the average Edo dweller likely knew absolutely nothing about Christmas. December meant shorter days, hot miso soup, and warming your hands over the flickering coals of the hibachi. No trees lit up, no plum puddings, though, to be fair, they already had mochi, which frankly sticks to your ribs far better than shortbread. But while Christmas was still hovering politely outside the nation's consciousness, small moments of contact, letters exchanged, foreign books smuggled in, the occasional eye-widening conversation with a Western visitor, sprinkled clues that something festive was celebrated elsewhere in the world, something involving firelight, feasts, and all that baffling snowman business. These seeds, though quietly planted, would start to grow in the decades to come. But before they bloomed into department store trees and gingerbread frosted dreams, there was one more crucial ingredient, the sweet sticky touch of capitalism. And as the candlelight flickers across sliding shoji doors, let us wander, just slightly, into the glow of what Japan began to invent for itself. A holiday not entirely foreign, but not quite native either. Something deliciously in between. Where sponge cake lives beside sushi and Santa sometimes arrives on a bicycle. Let's ease into that curious concoction next. If you were a sailor in the 1800s, gently bobbing your way into a Japanese port aboard a European vessel, the twinkle of Christmas would have been duller than expected, perhaps entirely invisible. Japan, you see, was still wearing its cozy isolationist pajamas during much of the 19th century, tucked snugly under the warm futon of Sakoku, its closed country policy. foreign religions, including Christianity, were strictly discouraged, unless of course you happened to be a Dutch trader stationed in Nagasaki. And even then, celebration was done quietly, like a child sneaking cookies before bedtime. The Dutch, clever and persistent as windmill-building squirrels, had managed to secure a tiny toehold on Dejima, a small artificial island tethered just off Nagasaki. Imagine a man-made lemon slice on the edge of a steaming bowl of ramen, and you've got the idea. From there, they were allowed to trade under strict surveillance and left little cultural footprints where they could. But even their subdued Christmases had to be extremely subtle. No caroling, no trees, certainly no jolly men with beards clambering down non-existent chimneys. Just a quiet nod to Jesus over a plate of pickled fish, perhaps, and then back to pretending it was just another terribly average Tuesday. Meanwhile, high up in the snowy mountains or nestled deep within misty valleys, Japan's population was going about business as usual. December was more about rice harvests and nose-warming sack than mistletoe and candy canes. The idea of celebrating the birth of a distant foreign deity wasn't just strange. It was somewhere between irrelevant and illegal, depending on the decade. Still, things were slowly shifting. Winds from the west, carrying the aromas of roast turkey and mulled wine, among other more imperialistic intentions, were beginning to blow over the archipelago. Through trickling trade, diplomatic pokings, and a few very determined missionaries disguised as polite language teachers, the embers of European customs began to smoulder faintly in secluded corners. One such corner, the not-so-secret Christian enclaves. Despite serious persecution during earlier centuries, underground Christian communities, kakure kirishitan, or hidden Christians, had clung to fragments of their faith for generations. These brave souls had transformed their beliefs into something uniquely Japanese. Statues of the Virgin Mary, for example, subtly resembled bodhisattvas and could pass for Buddhist art at first glance. Their prayers were whispered behind closed shutters, and rituals were heavily adapted, like a game of ecclesiastical telephone played over 250 years. These communities didn't hold traditional Christmas services per se. How could they, with no church bells allowed to ring in celebration? But oral traditions sometimes included references to the Nativity. In the warmth of flickering oil lanterns, families might hum sacred songs in archaic Portuguese-Japanese hybrids. No trees, no gifts, but meaning oozing from every syllable. By now you might be wondering, did no Japanese person in the 1800s ever unwrap a gift or nibble on a mince pie beneath hastily strung pine boughs? Well, some did, but mostly those residing in treaty ports following the opening of Japan in the mid-19th century. After Commodore Perry swung by with his ships that looked suspiciously like floating bakeries with cannons, Japan began signing treaties with Western powers. Suddenly, Christmas had a little more breathing room, like loosening a stiff kimono collar after a very long formal dinner. Foreign enclaves sprang up in cities like Yokohama and Kobe. Here, amid slightly bewildered Japanese onlookers, gingerbread houses were built, barrels of plum pudding were imported, and turkeys, poor, confused turkeys, met their fate. Christmas was largely a foreigners-only event, but curious locals watched and listened. Some even joined in, for the novelty if nothing else. You could attend a Christmas party hosted by an English merchant, sip imported port, and be serenaded by someone attempting to render "God rest ye merry gentlemen" with ambiguous vowel choices. Still, it wasn't widespread, and certainly not formalized. The Meiji-Era was dawning, but the full sparkle of tinsel and Santa suits had yet to arrive. what we might call Christmas vibes in today's terms, were more like faint echoes, like hearing a carol from another apartment while bundled up with a good book and a mug of tea, wondering vaguely what the fuss is all about. But the stage was slowly being set by the twinkling of lanterns on treaty streets, by whispered songs in hidden homes, laying ribbons of curiosity that would one day unravel into something far more elaborate, something with cake and Colonel Sanders. But before that transformation could glitter across the nation, it would take one particular moment of cinematic diplomacy to fling the sleigh doors open. And that moment was quietly approaching. While Japan in the 1800s was a land whispering with Zen gardens, ink-brushed calligraphy, and the distant ring of temple bells, it was not, at least softly speaking, a place overrun with tinsel. Christmas, in the Western sense, had not yet made its jingly debut. And yet, curious things were beginning to happen in the quiet shadows of the Tokugawa era. By the early 19th century, Japan had been under Sakoku, its locked country policy, for nearly 2 centuries. Foreign influence was about as welcome as a raccoon in a tea ceremony, unless, of course, you were Dutch. The Dutch were the exception, allowed a toehold on a man-made island called Dejima, off the coast of Nagasaki. There, a group of proud and slightly bewildered Dutch traders crept through a year of calendars that included Christmas, though largely in a muted, homesick sort of way. Within the politely pruned borders of Japan, Christianity had been outlawed since the 1600s, associated with Portuguese missionaries' rebellion and the sort of unchecked iconography that made Tokugawa officials twitchy. Practicing Christianity could get you exiled, or worse, undergo the highly discouraging process of fumie, in which suspected believers were required to step on images of Christ or the Virgin Mary to prove their irreligion. Let's just say it wasn't the kind of festive footwork one associates with holiday cheer, but even repression has a few cracks in the wall, and into those crevices slipped strange little customs. A fir branch here, a mention of St. Nicholas in a foreign book, a distinctly not Japanese song hummed off-key in the Dutch quarter. It was barely Christmas, more like Christmas embryonic, but it had begun to exist in the margins, a ghost of carols to come. Let us now drift, as if on a curling thread of incense smoke, into the modest foreign enclave of Dejima around 1830. The Dutch garrison lived in awkward semi-isolation, separated by a footbridge and a small army of polite but extremely watchful Japanese officials. These men, both Dutch and Japanese, were engaged in an elaborate pantomime of trade diplomacy, scientific diplomacy, and let's not get deported today diplomacy. The Dutch, who had traded cinnamon for centuries and were well acquainted with the brighter spices of European tradition, attempted the occasional nod to the season. On December 25th, the cook might bake a cake with raisins if the supply ship wasn't too late. Perhaps a small mirror sent from Batavia would be unwrapped and admired. Sometimes there might be a short speech by the head of the trading post, which would trail off quietly into the Nagasaki wind, while the Japanese interpreters blinked politely, pretending they didn't notice the strange foreign rituals. No holly, no chestnuts, certainly no mistletoe, unless you count the dried edible seaweed, which, when squinted at from the right angle and under the influence of seasonal homesickness, might have passed for it. Within the Japanese cities themselves, life continued with elegant indifference to the Western calendar. Midwinter festivals, yes. Celebrations of the moon and harvest, surely. But December 25th? It was simply another day on the lunar calendar. Perhaps someone was writing a haiku about plum blossoms. Perhaps an elderly samurai was instructing a young apprentice in the correct posture for tea. They were not hanging stockings. However, beneath the surface, a curiosity brewed. Rangaku, or Dutch learning, allowed sanctioned pockets of intellectuals to study Western texts. Medical treatises, mechanical diagrams, and even astronomy books began to tiptoe into scholarly circles. It wouldn't take long before someone inevitably asked, "What's all this snow-covered pine tree business anyway?" Indeed, it wasn't the spirituality of Christmas that intrigued early Japanese scholars. It was the science of it. How strange, they thought, that Westerners celebrated the winter solstice with pine-scented trees and puzzles about babies in mangers. It was filed away politely next to concepts like heliocentrism and the frightening idea of boiling potatoes with cream. Still, in rooms full of scrolls and inkstones, discussions turned soft and speculative. A learned man might point to a European painting of angels and sheep and marvel at the extravagant use of colour. Another might quietly imitate the pronunciation of Christmasu, just to taste the foreignness of it on the tongue. Tokyo didn't know it was waiting. In time, the snowflake would land, melt, and leave behind an idea. But for now, Christmas in 1800s, Japan lingered like an imported seed resting in cold soil. And so, as Dutch traders wrote wistful letters home, and Japanese scholars puzzled over curious seasonal customs in passing footnotes, the island nation tilted gently on its axis, one winter nearer to an eventual embrace of jingles. Soon, quiet changes would begin to creep inward. On steamships, in shop windows, and through the glimmer of gas lamps just beginning to illuminate a wider world. The 1800s were not precisely a golden age for Christmas caroling in Japan, unless, of course, your idea of a carol is the echo of a Buddhist bell tolling gently over a snowy hillside while someone politely inquires if you'd like more fermented turnips. And yet, while the scent of cinnamon and spruce was rare, verging on imaginary, there were a few unlikely places where flickers of Yule began to glow, though you had to squint very hard through a cloud of rice steam to see them. Much of the magic, or at least the confusion, started in ports. Not Christmas ports like mulled wine and gingerbread, but literal seaports, busy with foreign ships and foreign boots and foreign ideas, all unloading themselves into whichever treaty port seemed most hospitable that week. Nagasaki, for example, had long been Japan's curious little porthole to the west, but by the mid to late 1800s, Yokohama had elbowed its way in with newer docks and more intrusive holiday cheer. By the 1870s, Yokohama's foreign settlement had grown into a jolly hive of expats, many of whom were European merchants, diplomats, or people who wore waistcoats unironically. These individuals, determined to preserve their seasonal customs, even in lands where reindeer were as real as dragons, began importing Christmas with them, along with barrels of brandy and boxes of questionable fruitcake. The shops along Yokohama's Bund, newly spruced with Victorian architecture and Western-style signage, began to dabble in December decor. Paper garlands, strings of candles, the occasional evergreen branch from a thoroughly bewildered pine tree. The first Christmas trees ever displayed in Japan were almost certainly in foreigners' homes, perhaps in the drawing room of a British consulate or a German trader's villa, flickering gently under the confused eyes of a Japanese servant who had no idea why the head of the house had placed a tree indoors, decorated it with ribbon, and then proceeded to sing to it. Fair enough. And then, because Japan is nothing if not observant and suspiciously excellent at turning other people's habits into sleek new traditions, native merchants began to take notice. Around the same time, Western-style department stores were beginning to bloom in big cities like Tokyo and Osaka. Mitsukoshi, for instance, originally a kimono seller founded in 1673, began transforming into a Western-style retail pioneer, which meant, eventually, that Christmas wasn't just foreign anymore. It became fashionable. Now, to be clear, most Japanese people still had no idea what Christmas was about. They didn't know Mary, Joseph, or the theological significance of frankincense. But what they did know was that the foreigners seemed very keen on this December thing, happy enough to put themselves into plump coats, eat sweet things, and for some reason, hang stockings that looked suspiciously like undergarments by a fireplace. Naturally, the children were the first to show interest, especially when it became evident that gifts were involved. This created a brief and wildly inaccurate belief that some ghostly man in red would sneak into homes bearing trinkets, preferably without causing property damage. Department stores seized this opportunity. They put up brilliant window displays with European-style dolls and porcelain tea sets and anything else that could be vaguely associated with Yuletide whimsy. In some cases, store staff even dressed as Santa Claus, Egeishaosi, development both delightful and confusing, especially in regions where the closest approximation to a sleigh was a rickshaw. But let us not leave the impression that the Japanese invented consumer Christmas purely from scratch. They had help. Missionaries and educators, many of whom came under the new Meiji government's enthusiasm for westernization, brought not only the English language and algebra, but also an occasional Bible verse about angels singing and babies in mangers. Some schools, especially those established by Christian groups, began hosting Christmas pageants or nativity plays, occasionally starring students who had never seen a sheep in real life. This early flirtation with Christmas gave the holiday a kind of dreamy, mismatched quality, like a collage made from winter postcards and candle wax, stitched with silk thread and sprinkled with snow that never quite fell convincingly in the Japanese climate. But it had begun. Christmas had quietly wandered ashore, probably with a slight sunburn and an overpacked suitcase, unsure of its reception, but determined to stay a while. And just like that, as Yokohama's bay lights shimmered on cold December nights and department store clerks practiced their Merry Kurisumasu, a simple idea crept across the lintels of curious households. Perhaps cheer, no matter how foreign, is worth peeking into. Next, we'll drift into the curious world of seasonal sweets and how one German cake took a slow boat to fame on Japanese plates in the stillness of coastal winter as the sea around Nagasaki whispered against the shore like a drowsy cat rearranging itself on a mat. An unusual hum could sometimes be heard within the narrow Dutch quarter. It was faint, barely there, like the memory of a carol half remembered, but it was distinctively not Japanese. This hushed December murmur belonged to the small band of Dutch traders and associated riffraff who had permission to exist very delicately on the man-made island of Dejima. Dejima, if you're wondering, was sort of like the world's tiniest little Europe, a fan-shaped barricaded dock tethered to Nagasaki by a single bridge and a whole lot of suspicion. Think of it as a diplomatic fish tank, featuring fully dressed 19th century gentlemen with impressive facial hair and absolutely no privacy. By the early 1800s, these Dutch merchants were the only Westerners still allowed to maintain a limited commercial foothold in Japan, under the shogunate's self-imposed Sakoku isolation policy. It was a policy of polite national ghosting, and it had been going strong since the 1630s. But even isolationists get curious, and from time to time, particularly when sweets were involved, they let a few foreign habits drizzle in through the cracks. Christmas, however, was not one of those desirable imports. Officially, of course, it was radioactive. The holiday was, after all, scandalously Catholic in origin, and Catholicism had been banned in Japan since the 17th century with a level of intensity usually reserved for extremely aggressive squirrels. Missionaries had caused quite the commotion in the earlier centuries, and, much like in-laws after a particularly dramatic family dinner, the Tokugawa regime thought it best not to invite them back. So any tinsel or jingle in early 1800s Japan had to be executed with the utmost discretion. That didn't entirely stop the Dutch, of course. These gentlemen were not exactly brimming with Yuletide enthusiasm. They were merchants, not minstrels. But they had a certain melancholic respect for the calendar and their own traditions. In tiny gatherings behind shuttered windows on Dejima, they might raise a glass, very slowly, so as not to attract any suspicion, and nod gravely at the date. December 25th. There might be a plate of sugar bread, perhaps a cinnamon-scented biscuit that had travelled improbably across oceans and heat and time with all the excitement of a stowaway pastry. There might even be an awkward round of humming. No lyrics, of course. No need to explain why someone just said heavenly hosts. And a brief philosophical conversation about the strangeness of celebrating the birth of a Messiah while being surveilled by politely stern samurai. As for gifts, oh, none of that frivolity. A practical pair of sturdy socks might be exchanged, or perhaps a new ledger to keep track of how dreadfully cold it remained in the drafty little Dutch living quarters. One man, according to clangy second-hand diaries, once gave another a brass inkpot, shaped like a fish. Whether this was meant as a gesture of good faith or passive-aggressive symbolism remains unclear. On the Japanese side, of course, Christmas didn't exist, but it did not exist either. Curious interpreters and scholars, ever the clever types, must have noticed the odd solemnities and secret cakes being handed about. Rangaku scholars, those brilliant minds digesting all things Dutch learning, were likely amused by these twinkling oddities of European culture. If science and anatomy could be useful, surely celebrating in winter with bread and chant was not entirely without charm. Imagine, if you will, a young Japanese interpreter standing outside the walls of Dejima, hearing an out-of-tune hum muffled by closed shoji screens. He tilts his head. It sounds like a chant, but not a Buddhist one. Perhaps he jots it down. Foreign ritual, midwinter, affirmation of joy, food involved. And then he wanders off to log it into his growing notebook of peculiar Dutch behaviours, sandwiched between entries on cheese and telescopes. Of course, none of this was widely adopted. Christmas in Japan, in this oldest chapter, was a ghost, half felt, never spoken. A secret ceremony on a secret island, marked less by bells and more by biscuits and mild social tension. But every ripple begins somewhere, they say, and even suppressed carols can echo long beyond the walls that try to silence them. What began as a whisper behind shutters would, in time, drift beyond the island, changing shape as it moved, absorbing custard, candles, and eventually an unusual amount of fried chicken. But that, is something that would unfold much, much later. For now, December lay quiet in Edo-era Japan, the stars chilly and unmoving above, as a ship's lantern flickered gently in the Nagasaki harbor, waiting for the next story to arrive with the tide. Snowflakes, if they fell at all in 1800s Japan, fluttered like bashful paper cranes, timid, rare, and not especially inclined to linger. Most of the country, particularly in the Kanto region, was more familiar with a chilly drizzle than a white Christmas. But even without snow, a peculiar frostiness had settled over anything that resembled Christian celebration. During the first half of the 19th century, the very idea of Christmas in Japan may as well have been whispered in the dark corners of a folding screen, delicate murmurs mostly ignored, occasionally frowned upon by authority, and generally considered about as exotic as boiled Brussels sprouts. You see, Christianity had been banned in Japan since the early 1600s. It was treated not so much as a religion, but as a sort of virulent spiritual flu, imported by Europeans with unusually ornate clothing and the disconcerting habit of drinking wine during religious rituals without sharing. The Tokugawa shogunate, Japan's ruling military government of the era, went to extensive lengths to stamp out Christian practice. They posted signs warning citizens of the dangers of Western religion, expelled missionaries, and even implemented the distressingly awkward practice of requiring suspected Christians to step on religious icons to prove they weren't secretly cultivating a nativity scene under their tatami mats. So the idea of hanging stockings or roasting chestnuts on an open fire. Peasants in 1800s Japan would have been much more familiar with roasting sweet potatoes on a charcoal hibachi while sitting cross-legged beneath a heated kotatsu, with absolutely no knowledge of reindeer, jingle bells, or an elderly man in a red suit with a flying sled powered by herbivorous mammals. And yet, in curious places, Christmas began to creep in, not loudly, not with carols or eggnog, but like a foreign scent carried on the sea breeze, thanks mostly to ships that bobbed in Japanese harbors like floating islands of confusion and European custom. Let's wander, hazily now, toward the far western port city of Nagasaki, where, in spite of the nation's isolationist stance, a small trickle of foreign presence had been allowed. Here, Dutch merchants resided on the artificial island of Dejima, a rather resigned and polygonal puddle of land, tethered to the coast like an unwanted in-law. For over 2 centuries, these Dutch traders had been Japan's only sanctioned contact with the outside world, a peculiar privilege they repaid in with restrained pageantry and exhaustive patience. Among their shipments of lenses, clocks, and dangerously Western philosophies was also the quiet arrival of cultural detritus, including, yes, the occasional hint of Christmas cheer. But it's important to understand, the Christmas observed among the Dutch traders of Dejima wasn't quite the boisterous, eggnog-drenched revelry you might imagine. It was more Presbyterian, subdued, possibly accompanied by a poorly tuned violin and 2 biscuits. Maybe 3, if someone's wife was feeling wild. The Japanese staff and interpreters who worked on Dejima likely saw this strange festival as just another eccentricity, right alongside fork usage and the incomprehensible decision to wear wool in humid conditions. What's even more intriguing is that the local children of Nagasaki developed a half-curious, half-bewildered fascination with these foreign customs. They might gather, barefoot and vaguely sticky from mochi, to stare through the gates at the odd rituals of the foreigners. A decorative sprig here, a modest feast there. Nothing garish, but enough to suggest that something was being celebrated, albeit in a muted, Protestant sort of way. And so, if one squints with the eyes of imagination, perhaps a few kernels of Western Christmas managed to find purchase in Japanese soil, even if most people weren't entirely sure what it was, or why it involved putting socks near fire. Still, outside Dejima, no one was hanging tinsel. Santa had not yet obtained a visa, and every mention of Christianity was about as welcome as a sneeze during a tea ceremony. But the idea, faint, foreign and frosted, had now docked, however briefly, in Japanese waters. The lanterns of Dejima flickered in the winter dusk. Cherry trees, leafless and shivering in the cold, waited for a more appropriate celebration in spring. And across the sea, in bustling Edo, life carried on, untroubled, mostly unaware of the faint jingle of foreign bells. But something had opened. Let's tiptoe quietly now, deeper into Edo's quiet alleys, where the sound of getter clogs echoes like wind chimes on an empty street, and where a curious shopkeeper, miles from Dejima, begins to stumble across something oddly red and white in the imported cloth section. Let us now drift west of Edo's rice paper-lined corridors to the gently bobbing decks of Yokohama's harbour, as it stood under the pierce of a winter sun in the mid-1800s. At first glance, one might think the sea itself had become more festively foreign. Ships rocked lazily in the water, their masts festooned with garlands, and occasionally one would spot a peculiar pine tree lashed unconvincingly to a bow post, clearly an import from lands where people knew what snow looked like regularly. This was no ordinary December. No, this was Christmas as interpreted through the polite curiosity and occasional bewilderment of Japan just beginning to breathe in the peppermint-scented gusts of Western influence. And nowhere was this cultural gingerbread blending more evident than in the foreign settlement of Yokohama. After the 1854 arrival of Commodore Perry's diplomatic blunderbusses, Japan's Sakoku policy, its centuries-long nap from international comings and goings, was being slowly peeled back like a sleepy mandarin. Trade began to trickle. Missionaries arrived, carrying both scripture and suspiciously jingly bells. And with them came the traditions of Christmas, trailing behind like pine needles on a wool sock. Now, let us imagine a bundled-up missionary, perhaps a stoutly cheerful one named Reverend Thomas Gubbins. He was rather proud of the way he spoke Japanese, even if most locals thought he was simply announcing fish prices incorrectly. Merry Kurisumasu, he'd enthuse to shopkeepers, who nodded politely while hiding puzzled smiles behind their fans. Mr. Gubbins led one of the very first midnight services in Yokohama. By midnight, of course, we mean 8 p.m., which was considered quite daringly late for the era. The service featured a pipe organ that had been lovingly shipped from Liverpool, but played mostly sea shanties due to unfortunate mariner confusion. A Christmas tree was erected, painstakingly, using local cedar and some strategically tied origami cranes. There was a great deal of standing around and admiring involved, though minimal comprehending. But the real action came in the exchange of gifts, an act the local merchants quickly understood required neither deep catechismal study nor fluency. Western gentlemen passed out perfectly square boxes wrapped in bright cloth, while local shopkeepers offered basketfuls of tangerines, rice crackers, or the occasional startled carp. One British trader, in a rush of holiday panic, accidentally gave a bonsai as a gift, but forgot to prune it first. It was later described by the recipient as emotionally overwhelming. And then there were the Christmas banquets. Ah, yes, heartwarming collisions of taste and translation. The foreigners, stung by homesickness and an alarming lack of eggnog, attempted to prepare traditional fare. Ingredients were substituted with whatever local approximations could be found. Turkey, being rare and elusive in the region, was replaced with duck, or sometimes octopus, tucked neatly under sprigs of rosemary, if one squinted optimistically. For dessert, puddings were boiled with great enthusiasm, if not great accuracy. There were incidents involving seaweed accidentally mistaken for suet. One indomitable Scottish merchant was convinced he could make a black bun from miso paste and pickled plums. He could not. But while these festivities may sound like the stuff of culinary apology letters, they were deeply meaningful. They represented attempts, often clumsy, often charming, to share joy, to forge brief, shimmering connections between worlds that once floated entirely apart. And the Japanese, observers, many found it all deeply amusing and secretly delightful. Children were fascinated by stories of reindeer that flew, a concept that appealed to both Shinto reverence for nature and childhood fondness for improbable mammals. Artisans produced woodblock prints of Father Christmas, who, in early renderings, looked suspiciously like a red-robed tanuki. In the years to come, Christmas would take root in curious ways, but back then, it was like watching a snowflake land quietly in a bamboo grove. Delicate, novel, and bound to melt. The bells of the port town chimed quietly, some from churches, others from ships preparing to sail. And in the hush between languages, under strings of paper lanterns and evergreen cuttings, a new tradition slowly exhaled its first breath. Just beyond the flickering lights of Yokohama, another town was stirring with its own peculiar version of cheer, one involving silk merchants, sugar plums, and something suspiciously resembling a nativity made entirely of origami. Let's wander together that way now, shall we? By the mid-19th century, as Japan's long and contemplative Edo period meandered into its closing credits, the country found itself tiptoeing awkwardly toward global interaction, like someone uncertain whether to join a dance floor already in motion. This was a time when Christmas still peeked shyly from behind the shoji door, unsure whether it was welcome at the party. It had been centuries, after all, since Christianity had been banned and buried under the metaphorical floorboards, like that odd piece of furniture no one talks about, but everyone knows is there. But then came Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853, steaming into Tokyo Bay with more cannonballs than conversation skills, wielding a treaty in one hand and cultural upheaval in the other. And with that came trickles of Western customs, once again making their way into the folds of Japanese society, alongside railroads, top hats, and the ever-pragmatic pocket watch. Christmas, dear listener, hitched a quiet ride on the coattails of modernity. However, before you imagine snowmen parading through Kyoto or chestnuts roasting in Shibuya, allow me to recenter your expectations. Christmas in 1800s. Japan didn't burst into existence with sleigh bells or jolly red costumes. First, it smuggled itself into mission schools, whispered through merchant enclaves, and glimmered faintly through the frost-edged windows of foreign settlements, especially in the open port cities like Yokohama and Nagasaki, which had acquired something of a reputation for being cultural sneak peeks. These ports, bustling, messy, and oddly fashionable, were microcosms of worldliness. In Yokohama, one might observe British traders nervously carving roast goose while comparing cravat sizes, or German merchants singing carols with all the subtlety of a brass band at nap time. Their Japanese neighbors, curious as raccoons at a lantern festival, tiptoed close to peer in on, these foreigners strapping pine trees to living room walls and sending each other greetings written in characters that looked more like tipsy ants marching uphill than any sensible script. Soon, merchants began selling small pine trees of dubious symmetry, and confectioners started experimenting with sweet cakes and breads meant to mimic the festive delicacies of the West. One rather imaginative bakery in Yokohama even attempted to recreate a Christmas pudding, though the result was described by one unfortunate taste tester as mysteriously explosive, and not suitable for human consumption without diplomatic immunity. Still, curiosity brewed like a fine hojicha, and a strange hybrid form of Christmas began to crystallize within these cosmopolitan corners. The holiday became something of a charming oddity, an occasion for Westerners in Japan to gather, reminisce, and roast things, all while drinking strange amounts of mulled wine and attempting Japanese phrases with results both endearing and ambiguous. Meanwhile, Japanese observers adopted the sweeter, shinier elements with the careful enthusiasm of someone trying on an unfamiliar hat at a foreign boutique, cautious, amused, and a little uncertain whether it suits their face. Within the institutions run by missionaries, mostly from France, Portugal, and the United Kingdom, Christmas was celebrated with subtle pageantry. Students might perform nativity plays featuring papier-mâché donkeys and baby dolls wrapped in borrowed kimono scraps. Carols were sung in gentle discord, echoing softly through chilly wooden halls. Despite the intimacy of these events, they helped plant small, glimmering seeds in the cultural soil. Seeds that, in time, would bloom into brightly lit department stores and televised Christmas specials. It was during this time that gift-giving began to take on a whisper of relevance, not within the broader public, but among small communities where Western customs hovered like starlight above well-mannered gatherings. The gifts were often modest: hand-sewn samplers, curious candies, books, or the ever-so-practical woolen socks. Socks, it turns out, are an international love language, especially in drafty 19th century houses. And in a curiously lovely twist, some Japanese families began exchanging handmade tokens on December 25th. Not necessarily because they celebrated the birth of Christ, but because humans, regardless of geography, tend to get a bit sentimental in the colder months. A folded crane, a poem scrawled in delicate calligraphy, a small pouch of roasted chestnuts, all given without fanfare, tucked quietly into sleeves or lunchboxes with the subtle sincerity the Japanese have always perfected. As the lanterns dimmed and the stars arranged themselves with their usual unbothered elegance, Christmas in 1800s Japan hadn't quite arrived, but it had sent its calling card. There it rested, half invitation, half curiosity, drifting slowly through the corridors of time, waiting patiently for the next chapter in its journey across the archipelago. And speaking of which, the snow has started to fall again, soft as rice flour on tatami mats. Just in time for another unlikely visitor. In the final years of the 19th century, as Japan's Meiji-Era rolled along like a stately ox cart cautiously testing the speed limit, something quite peculiar began to rattle the paper walls of custom. Christmas was getting fancier hats. Not literal hats, metaphorical hats, although there were indeed some actual hats involved. By this point in time, foreign enclaves like Yokohama had begun to turn December into a winter theatre of polite chaos. Westerners celebrated Christmas with the same determination that Britons brought to organising cricket games in the middle of monsoon season. Japanese onlookers, ever the diligent observers of foreign peculiarity, watched these chilly December rituals with the fascinated caution one might reserve for a cat trying to understand a rocking chair. There was Christmas pudding, which to the Japanese palate might have resembled an accidental collision between a raisin and a brick. There were tinsel-saturated drawing rooms, imported fir trees that looked oddly melancholy in the moist coastal air, and the ceaseless clinking of brandy glasses belonging to very pink-faced Englishmen attempting to sing carols 2 keys too low. And yet, amidst the flurry of imported geese and musical misjudgments, the nativity managed to sneak into Japanese department stores. Yes, department stores. These grand palaces of glass and gaslight were the latest fascination of modernity, where shoppers could buy anything from hand-dyed kimono to London-made top hats. And now, an angel made entirely of cotton wool and unresolved historical discomfort. Mitsukoshi, the pioneering department store in Tokyo, began adorning its windows with decorative displays that borrowed liberally from European ideas of festivity. More than once, confused passers-by found themselves staring at wax figures in snow-dappled Victorian garb, pointing dramatically toward a pine tree indoors, as if this were all terribly natural. The question of why the pine tree was indoors remained unanswered, as did the mystery of why the bearded man in red, likely a loose interpretation of some overflowing department store catalogue from Boston, was suddenly distributing hard candies to small children without much explanation. But then, what better way to embrace modernity than to accept a heavily disguised saint whose sleigh seemingly went unregistered with the local authorities? The Japanese press, always eager to explain such emerging customs to a curious readership, began publishing articles about kurisumasu. Some writers used this seasonal curiosity as a way to discuss Western values, generosity, hospitality, and the ever-important ability to roast a turkey with more enthusiasm than actual heat. Others, with tongue firmly in cheek, treated Christmas as yet another Tokyo fashion for the elite, like riding in a rickshaw with European shoes or insisting your dog understood English. Still, not everyone was content to remain an amused observer. Some Japanese Christians, yes, they did exist quietly, took genuine comfort in the season. Churches in places like Nagasaki and Kobe held modest services, lit candles, and gathered for humble meals. Their celebrations were less about pine odors and stolen carols, and more about spiritual reflection. Far from the flurry of tinsel in Tokyo, these communities held fast to what they believed Christmas meant, even if nobody was entirely certain how best to roast a chestnut. Back in the city, some restaurants, eager to prove their Western credentials, offered Christmas dinners that were both brave and confused. Roast beef might appear alongside miso soup. Custard stood next to pickled daikon with the polite awkwardness of strangers on a long elevator ride. Toasted white bread with strawberry jam became a sort of panicked stand-in for British plum pudding. At one inn, a French traveller reported receiving a festive bun containing precisely one raisin, described as a lonely island in a starchy sea. Whether intentional symbolism or just rationing, nobody ever found out. Still, these small, tentative stumbles toward festive celebration contained something rather precious. Curiosity without cynicism. For perhaps the first time, and certainly not the last, Japan was trying on Christmas like a kimono with foreign buttons. Not quite sure where everything belonged, but willing to try anyway. And so, as December evenings brushed Tokyo's rooftops with gaslit warmth and hints of imported cinnamon tea, the holiday took root. Not loudly, not solemnly, but gently. Like a snowflake that doesn't quite stick, but makes you look up nonetheless. Somewhere near Ginza, a shopkeeper arranging ceramic Santa figurines by lantern light might have wondered what gifts would come next. Not the ones inside stockings, but the curious shapes of change itself. And just beyond that window pane, another little miracle waited in the darkness, made not of sleigh bells, but something much quieter. A story yet to unfold, softly, gently, in the streets where east and west began to hum in quiet harmony, as the soft snow of a Japanese December fell with deliberate indifference upon tile roofs and bamboo groves. The peculiar tale of a shopkeeper named Sano Ichiro gently unfolded in the narrow alleyways of Yokohama. Sano, whose beard waged a minor but dignified rebellion against common grooming standards, had recently become the proud and slightly bewildered owner of a mysterious, newly imported holiday tradition, the Christmas stocking. It had arrived uninvited on a cargo manifest from Liverpool, nestled between crates of dusty telescopes and an overly optimistic shipment of woolen underpants. A Western trader had explained the tradition to Sano with great enthusiasm, but very little linguistic precision. The result was that Sano now firmly believed Christmas stockings were magical sacks that summoned oranges when properly respected. Sano, therefore, displayed his single imported red woolen stocking on a highly visible hook outside his shop. The stocking was by far the most festive object on the entire street. Beneath it, he placed a hand-painted sign in uneven katakana that read, roughly, "Please whisper your citrus wishes into the sock." He didn't understand the full scope of Christmas, of course. Japan, still in the delicate process of adjusting to global influences after the end of over 2 centuries of sakoku, its closed-door policy, was a bit like someone waking up halfway through a party they didn't realize they were hosting. By 1870, Japan had officially shed the isolationist skin of the Tokugawa shogunate and was now stretching toward the new dawn of the Meiji-Era. Railroads were snaking across the countryside, top knots were falling out of fashion, and someone had to figure out what to do with all the prancing angels on imported wrapping paper. Back at Sano's shop, customers began to come. Not in droves, of course, but in the gently curious trickle befitting a society just beginning to flirt with foreign holidays. A young seamstress named Haru pressed her face delicately to the window, debating whether a stocking might improve her sewing business. An elderly man named Daisuke insisted the sock should be respected as a form of traveling spirit container and offered it a modest bowl of white rice. On Christmas morning, though the date was more guess than gospel, Sano awoke early, lit his kerosene lamp, and shuffled out to the stocking, which had now accumulated a crust of polite frost and a surprisingly earnest paper crane someone had nestled inside. He reached in solemnly, looking for the orange he had asked for in a whisper, both bashful and oddly businesslike. There was no orange. Instead, he found a walnut and a British farthing, which suggested either St. Nicholas was having an off day or the foreign children across the alley had started playing currency-based pranks. Sano kept both. He claimed the walnut reminded him of resilience and was, incidentally, delicious, and the coin he nailed to the doorframe to keep out mischievous spirits, particularly economic ones. News spread. A few other merchants took up their own versions of the display. Bamboo stockings became a thing, delightfully impractical and extremely flammable. Children delighted in the idea that a red sock could bring surprises, even if most surprises turned out to be button collections or solemn anonymous haikus. Meanwhile, the concept of the Western Christmas had begun charming the upper ranks of Meiji society, who were in the midst of an enthusiastic hobbies and hats phase. The aristocracy took to imitating European Christmas feasts, often with a slight translation gap. Goose was replaced with grilled eel. Figgy pudding was reimagined with adzuki beans and politely misunderstood. Yet that humble stocking outside Sano's shop may have been the first quiet step towards something endearingly peculiar. Japan's own gentle remix of Christmas, filtered through paper lanterns, curious curiosity, and a nation trying to understand whether Santa was a monk, a wizard, or just an exceptionally devoted postal worker. And nestled in the cool winter light of that December day, Sano refilled the stocking with his own contribution. A note that read, "Leave something little, take something light." It was the spirit of a holiday not quite his own, rewoven into something quietly generous, wholly local, yet curiously global, slightly confused, but beating with warmth. And just beyond the edge of the harbour, another ship anchored, and with it came new cargo, new tales, and something altogether frothy. Which leads us, of course, to the case of the Tokyo Christmas cake. In the soft, snowy hush of late December, somewhere between a paper lantern's glow and the patient steeping of green tea, you could find the earliest appearances of Christmas in 1800s Japan, crouching awkwardly in the corner like a foreign guest at a family reunion, unsure whether to remove its boots. You see, by the mid-1800s, Japan had spent over 2 centuries politely declining outside influences with the tenacity of a grandmother refusing help with the dishes. The country was in the firm, if cozy, grip of sakoku, its policy of national seclusion. Foreigners were few, foreign holidays even fewer, and the notion of a jolly man in red squeezing down a chimney was as bewildering as a tanuki in tuxedo. But then came Perry. Yes, Commodore Matthew Perry. Not the one from Friends, the other one. The one who showed up in Tokyo Bay in 1853 with black ships, restless cannons, and the unmistakable energy of a man who had not been invited to the party but RSVP'd anyway. His arrival cracked open the bamboo gates of isolation, and soon Western customs began tiptoeing into Japanese life, some gingerly, like an intrigued cat, and others more like a sumo wrestler in a tutu. Now, one of the more persistent foreign presences was the missionaries. European and American men with damp collars and Bibles held at hopeful angles. They'd come eager to introduce Christianity to the land of the rising sun, often blending faith with hot porridge and suspiciously cheerful hymns. And while religious conversion was a thorny endeavour, cultural seepage was inevitable. It began subtly, a hymn sung faintly through shoji screens, a pine branch strung up in a Yokohama church, small, whispered mentions of kurimasu, a word that tumbled over Japanese tongues with charming inaccuracy. By the 1870s, following the Meiji Restoration, the foreign settlements were humming a merry little tune in December. Technically, Christmas still wasn't widely celebrated by most Japanese, but it had a growing fan base among the curious. In the port cities of Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki, bakeries and general stores began taking liberties. There were modest attempts at Western-style treats, which in the earliest days turned out to be unexpected hybrids, fruitcake that had somehow mingled with rice flour, gingerbread that bowed politely before being eaten. The Japanese, as it turned out, were astonishingly good at absorbing foreign ideas and making them their own, like cultural origami. Take, for instance, the Western Christmas tree, where in Europe it was a pine-studded explosion of ornaments. In Japan, it was elegant, minimalist, and sometimes made entirely out of paper. Even imported tinsel seemed to stand a little straighter in the presence of a tatami mat. Local artists, ever attuned to visual storytelling, began sketching Santas with a distinctly Japanese flair. Some featured Santa in a kimono. One overzealous woodblock artist apparently drew Santa riding a crane instead of a sleigh. The reindeer, perhaps, were unavailable. But perhaps the oddest and most charming development in these early Japanese Christmases was the utter lack of snow in many places. Unlike the storybooks, large parts of Japan don't receive much snow in December. And so, Early Japanese Christmas cards showed snowy forests that nobody had actually seen, fireworks inexplicably framing the nativity, and crackers, those British pop open party paraphernalia, painted as though they carried deep moral symbolism. For the children born in foreign enclaves, December 25th was a whimsical anomaly, a day when their households were filled with strange, sweet-smelling foods, stories about a rotund intruder breaking into homes under cover of darkness, and the innocent thrill of gift expectation. Japanese neighbors and friends politely glanced in, mildly puzzled, perhaps charmed, wondering whether this Santa-san would bring them anything. He did not, at first, and yet the seeds were planted, slowly, gently, in the minds of bakers who began to wonder what a Christmas cake might look like, in department stores which would later learn of the economic volcano that was seasonal novelty, and in a handful of school children who heard carols and hummed them without knowing the words. Outside, the wind fluttered through bamboo groves, unconcerned with imported holidays. But inside the flickering warmth of these foreign homes, somewhere amid the clatter of crockery and the penciled outlines of imported customs, Christmas was learning how to whisper in Japanese. And so, with the port doors slightly ajar and the scent of imported cinnamon just beginning to mingle with soy sauce, let us drift further into this misty tale, toward a time when department stores discovered snow and Colonel Sanders prepared to put on a little red hat. One of the strangest things about Christmas in 1800s Japan, aside from the minor detail that it wasn't celebrated, is that when it did begin to quietly creep into the culture, it wasn't really in December. Well, not only in December. It had a habit of popping up at odd times, much like a very polite ghost who doesn't realize you're in the bath. This curious emergence starts quietly in the port cities, especially Yokohama, where a small population of foreign nationals lived, worked, and occasionally insisted on singing Christmas carols with distressing amounts of harmony. These international enclaves came bearing goose roasts, tinsely trees, and holly-themed confusion. Among the Japanese locals watching from a careful and respectful distance, early attempts at understanding were remarkably accurate. A Western midsummer winter rite filled with cake and the ritual drinking of all available liquor. Fascinating. Let us zoom into a brisk December morning in 1875, when the Yamate neighborhood of Yokohama was bold in its foreignness and often smelled faintly of nutmeg and coal smoke. Here, British merchants and German traders hung stockings with such confidence, you'd think St. Nicholas himself worked in shipping logistics. Passers-by would peer through the lace-curtained windows at things like evergreen garlands and children playing with something called crackers, which, despite the name, contained no rice and exploded in a courteous yet entirely surprising fashion. The Japanese locals, accustomed to detailed seasonal rituals, like New Year's Kadamatsu decorations meaning virtue, longevity, and general tidiness, looked delicately upon this Western revelry and wondered gently if the foreigners were perhaps all right. But Japan is a country of exquisite observational skills and stunning curiosity. And as the Meiji-Era unfolded like an origami fan, with its rapid modernization and enthusiasm for all things Western, Christmas wasn't tossed aside like a forgotten fruitcake. It was studied, sampled, and eventually translated into something entirely its own. Initially, Christmas didn't come home to the average Japanese citizen because it was a Christian holiday, and Christianity had been banned for over 2 centuries until the mid-1800s. The reopening of the country brought missionaries, of course, who brought along nativity plays and gospel carols, often sung in a slightly too large church building to 8 somewhat confused local spectators and 1 sleeping cat. But in department stores, those shimmering cathedrals of modernity and capitalist triumph, Christmas found a far more welcoming home. By the late 1800s, merchants, eyeing the Western penchant for purchasing items wrapped tightly in shiny disappointment, thought, why not? And so, in places like Ginza, one could begin to spot Christmas cakes, strikingly white, fluffy chiffon fantasies with errant strawberries and an admirable absence of theological symbolism. These cakes became a Japanese hallmark of the season, not because they were ancient or sacred. No, but because they were delicious, importable, and perfect for advertising. Curiously enough, they had nothing to do with Christmas pudding, which, to the Japanese palate, bore a worrisome resemblance to damp bread, left to ferment in a forgotten drawer. No, the cake was light, modern, and immensely photogenic. And so, as Japan absorbed Western customs, like a polite host trying foreign hors d'oeuvres, it selected the parts that sparkled best under gaslight. Santa Claus, rebranded more as an amiable gift man than a holy bishop, made early appearances in wool suits far too thick for Tokyo's mild winters. Children, naturally, adapted quickly to the idea of free toys, and parents, naturally, adapted quickly to the need for new storage solutions. But in the 1800s, beyond the port cities and missionary halls, Christmas remained a bit of foreign theatre, a seasonal curiosity on display like a Victorian snow globe, viewed, admired, but rarely shaken. Still, in homes where Western influences were strong, among diplomats, translators, government officials, the holiday took root in small candle-lit ways. A paper star here, a roast duck there. Christmas dinner might be followed by a round of Goethe readings, or perhaps a slightly awkward rendition of Silent Night, in a room that had, only a few hours earlier, hosted a completely unrelated tea ceremony. And this is where Christmas in Japan began to swirl with layers, like the tears of an increasingly confused sponge cake. Foreign, then familiar. Occasional, then increasingly visible. Never quite religious, but always just festive enough. It would be decades before Japan reimagined Christmas as the shimmering strawberry cake-filled celebration we know today. But the 1800s were the prelude. A soft overture played by brass bands newly trained in carols, sung under pine trees that had never seen snow. Now, let us drift further into the Meiji evening, where an Englishman hangs a mistletoe in a Tokyo parlor, entirely unaware of its romantic implications to his Japanese dinner guests. In the soot-dusted twilight of 19th century Yokohama, Christmas didn't arrive in sleighs or jingles, but rather on steamships and curiously wrapped parcels. Western customs wafted into Japanese life like foreign spices. Interesting, a little confusing, and definitely not part of the regular pantry. Merchants, missionaries, and moustache-waxing diplomats brought with them the holiday spirit, which for the Japanese of the era was less ho 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 and more what's this evergreen shrub doing indoors? Let us tiptoe into one of the more peculiar little corners of early Japanese Christmas, the curious case of imported fruitcake and the great gift exchange misinterpretation of 1871. Now, fruitcake, a dense, brick-like dessert with a shelf life rivaling some minor deities, was considered a festive delicacy among the Western expatriates living along the treaty ports. Someone, perhaps an ambitious trader with less than expert taste buds, had the gall to present one to a Japanese official as a holiday token. The official, unsure if it was food or masonry, accepted it gracefully, carefully stored it on a shelf, and then, after polite consultation, filed it under strategic materials. No one wanted to offend the foreign envoy, but no one knew what to do with the thing either. One particularly erudite interpreter even suggested it might be burned as incense. After all, it smelled vaguely sweet and slightly flammable. Meanwhile, among the school children of Yokohama, many of whom were attending newly opened Western-style schools, Christmas gave rise to an exciting annual event, the mystery of the foreign beard man. Every December, students were regaled with tales of a red-suited man who traveled the world at night, bypassed law enforcement entirely, and rewarded good behavior with treats. To some pupils, that sounded suspiciously like a European tengu, a mythical trickster birdman known for long noses, swooping in uninvited and making questionable judgment calls. It wasn't all confusion and fruitcakes, of course. Gradually, the aesthetic of Christmas began to take hold, particularly among merchant families and international hotels that frothed with enthusiasm for anything novel and faintly lucrative. Red paper lanterns started popping up alongside pine branches tied modestly to shop doors, often mistaken for New Year's adornments by the locals, a confusion no one was especially keen to correct. Two birds, one piece of decorative foliage, as the saying almost goes. In 1886, the Yamashiro-ya department store, which prided itself on selling both French perfumes and English umbrellas with equal indifference, erected what is widely regarded as one of Japan's first indoor Christmas trees, imported pine, over 6 feet tall, draped in tiny candles and tinsel imported from Hamburg. Shoppers stood in reverent amazement, unsure whether they were meant to bow to it, pray near it, or buy its snacks. A German music teacher in Nagasaki, Herr Klaus Meisner, made matters even more memorable when he attempted to stage a nativity play with local student actors. Long before the age of accurate subtitles, his Japanese translation of the story of Bethlehem turned swaddling clothes into ceremonial carp robes, and somehow the baby Jesus was briefly interpreted as a minor rice deity. The performance was warmly received, if only because the children looked so determined in their roles, and no one wanted to be the one who asked why the wise men were carrying sack gourds instead of frankincense. But regardless of the mistranslations, mismatched rituals, and misbehaving fruitcakes, a curious sort of cheer persisted. The Christmas of 1800s Japan wasn't a carbon copy of its Western cousin. It was more like a vaguely foggy dream, remembered through silk screens, a patchwork of snowflakes stitched onto rising suns. There were paper fans painted with holly leaves, boots filled not with candy, but with rice crackers, and children giggling at Santa figures who bore an uncanny resemblance to particularly generous daimyos. And as Christmas took its small, unsteady footsteps into Japanese consciousness, it began to coexist with the rhythms of the archipelago's indigenous celebrations, not as a conqueror of culture, but as a visitor, a holiday guest, who, somewhere between the shrines and the snowfall, was beginning to be invited in for green tea. As the December moon climbed lazily over the snow-dusted roofs of Hakodate, a few quiet notes of an organ drifted out from a small wooden church built by foreigners, shaped like an English chapel but smelling of hinoki wood and sake. A passing fisherman paused, listened, and nodded with a gentle smile. No idea what it meant, but it did sound festive, and it is there, under soft candlelight and experimental fruitcake digestion, that something else quietly began to take root. Something involving cakes of a different persuasion. But we'll save that sweet surprise for the next dreamy snowfall. In the quiet hush of a December evening in the 1800s, somewhere between the faraway crows of roosters that hadn't quite realized winter was not their season, and the gentle hum of wind nudging through bamboo groves, a strange thing was happening in one particular corner of Yokohama. Someone had just unwrapped a fruitcake. It wasn't just any fruitcake, mind you. This one had arrived all the way from England, having survived sea spray, salt air, a sailors' union feud, and 3 games of cribbage. It bore raisins like tiny ancient artifacts and candied fruits whose colours seemed more suspicious than festive. A Japanese merchant, curious and slightly alarmed, held it up by the string as though it might begin speaking in tongues. Western merchants, missionaries, and diplomats in treaty ports like Yokohama were continuing their awkward, festive experimentations with Christmas, much like toddlers with forks near electrical sockets, fascinated but not quite aware of the consequences. Inside one such foreign residence, a boxy building that tried very hard to resemble a European townhouse, but mostly looked like a beefed-up pagoda in fancy trousers, Christmas Eve had begun. An American clergyman named Reverend Morton had decided to host what he called a proper Christmas supper, despite the logistical hurdle that 92% of the ingredients on his mind didn't exist in Japanese markets. Locals peeked in through the latticed windows, not in suspicion or concern, but with the kind of serene curiosity one reserves for foreign birds or a man trying to ice skate on gravel. The Reverend had done his best. Roast fish in place of goose, coated in something that might have once hoped to be cranberry sauce, steamed rice instead of dinner rolls, and sake served from a teapot adorned with holly leaves someone had carefully snipped from a nearby garden. On a side table, carefully perched, was a tiny, handmade pine tree. More a pine twig, really, decorated with origami ornaments that wobbled gently whenever someone sneezed. A few visiting Europeans, gaunt from homesickness and the general shortage of figgy pudding, raised their porcelain cups and attempted a cheer. The sound was something between Merry Christmas and Please Pass the Salt, but the sentiment was there. Meanwhile, some Japanese guests, students of Western customs, local interpreters, and one observant grandmother who walked 40 minutes just to see what Christmas Sue tasted like, looked on with polite bemusement. The food was interesting. The decorations were curious, like theatrical props without a play, and the singing was otherworldly, quite literally, German carols sung by British throats in an American accent. Stille Nacht never sounded so enthusiastic yet so geographically confused. But it wasn't without charm. Children laughed as they were taught to hang paper stars. Guest musicians introduced the harmonica to a curious group of Japanese listeners who were just beginning to wonder if it was edible. And for a moment, the room was filled with something remarkably close to joy. Outside, snow began to fall. The shy, slow kind that flits through the air like it doesn't quite want to interrupt anything. Magnolias wore frosty shawls, and somewhere near the harbour, a stray cat pressed itself against a wooden wall, just near enough to absorb the warmth leaking out from this odd little mingling of east and west. Of course, Christmas didn't have any official place in Japan in the 1800s. No national holiday, no frantic department store sales, and certainly no televised reindeer. It wasn't recognized or regulated or even fully understood. But in these treaty port bubbles, it arrived anyway, like an unexpected house guest who brought their own pillows and a surprising number of fruit-based desserts. The Japanese regarded it with interest, amusement, and a cultural palate as yet unspoiled by commercial jingles. Bits of it, like the twinkling of stars in old poetry, began to settle in their minds. Some would write about it in journals. Others would try hanging red paper lanterns the next winter just to see how it felt. A few children would ask in hushed tones about the name Santa-san, not quite sure if he was a deity, a hero, or just someone with excellent logistical support. And so, like warm smoke slipping through roof tiles into the crisp December night, the spirit of this strange new festivity gently expanded, imperfect, mismatched, but curiously comforting. Just as the evening faded into a gentle quiet, and the last candle flickered too sleepily to hold its posture, someone poured the final cup of sake, raising it in a not quite English, slightly whispered toast to Christmas Asu. And with that, we'll gently tiptoe onward to a tale where Christian schoolgirls start unintentionally revolutionizing holiday traditions with sponge cake. As the 1800s tiptoed into their second half, Japan's quiet dance with Western ideas picked up tempo, albeit wearing tabis instead of tap shoes. Christmas still hadn't gotten its own rice cake yet, or even much more than a passing glance, but that didn't stop a curious new character from slipping into the seasonal stage, the foreign merchant. Oh yes, like snowflakes drifting in through open shoji doors, Western merchants arrived in places like Yokohama, Nagasaki, and Kobe after Japan opened a crack in its great wooden gate to international trade in 1854. These traders brought many things with them. Clocks that chimed hourly like confused cicadas, canned peaches in tins shinier than a daimyo's teacup, and clothing so heavily buttoned that it seemed the wearer's greatest wish was to never escape it. But along with trade goods came cultural odds and ends, and among them, one particularly jolly import, Christmas. Now, let's pause to appreciate the sheer comedic contrast. Imagine being a dignified merchant from Edo, known for your precise brushwork and impeccable haiku, and suddenly encountering a red-faced man with a belly that suggested too many preserved puddings, announcing himself as Santa Claus. It would have been like encountering a kabuki actor mid-performance while shopping for pickled daikon. Confusing, theatrical, and oddly compelling. In Yokohama in the 1860s, one of the few cities where foreign nationals could legally reside, the Christmas scene was a curious blend of diplomatic decorum and Western cheer. British, American, and, somewhat mysteriously, Prussian expatriates would gather in foreign settlements behind walls that kept out the nosy locals and the occasional stray goat. Behind these compound gates, Christmas trees imported, or imaginatively constructed, would sparkle with candles, a fire hazard that added festive suspense, and Christmas puddings, boiled to within an inch of their structural integrity, would take center stage. Children of foreign diplomats might wake to find small wooden toys or hard candies stuffed into stockings, or at least something approximating a stocking, perhaps a wool sock that courageously extended beyond its original intended duties. These micro-Christmases, tucked into corners of alien soil, flickered quietly amid well-steeped cups of imported tea, and the occasional carol sung with tones that startled nearby house lizards. Japanese onlookers, curious but cautious, watched these festivities from a respectful distance, equal parts bemused and intrigued. Some artisans found opportunity. A few entrepreneurial minds began to craft decorations resembling the foreign ones they'd seen. Paper garlands, painted toys, and eventually, the earliest whispers of imitation Santas carved from wood and painted with charming anatomical ambiguity. One can imagine the hum of speculation among local communities. Why, wondered a merchant's apprentice in the shadows of a sack shop, does this Western god bring gifts in winter and wear fur in a hot room? An excellent question. Even now, we're not entirely sure. The Japanese press, which was flourishing in those years after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, occasionally reported on these exotic midwinter happenings, but always with a voice that suggested a raised eyebrow and a tilted head. Christmas, it seemed, was considered somewhere between a diplomatic cultural curio and something best left to those odd cake-wielding foreigners on the other side of the ginnan tree. Still, bits of it slipped through. School children in mission-run classrooms whispered about reindeer and angels. Christmas-time cakes, eventually to become the now legendary strawberry shortcake of modern Japan, began their earliest whispers as imported confections sampled cautiously, like historical footnotes made of cream, and in homes where Japanese women had married foreign men, a rare but not unheard of arrangement, Christmas was observed in hybrid fashion, perhaps involving a prayer over rice, a plum pudding steamed improperly, and a post-dinner silence of culturally dissonant digestion. These early Christmas celebrations in 1800s Japan were flickers, not flares, not yet national rituals, not yet department store extravaganzas, just gentle oddities nestled in port towns, watched by lantern light and considered with thoughtful detachment. But change, like snow, has a way of piling up quietly at first before you realize your sandals have vanished beneath it. And so, as more foreign customs trickled in with the cargo and conversation, something curious crept silently closer on little felted boots. The idea that Christmas might offer not only international curiosity, but also an excellent excuse for cake, candlelight, and a firm winter nap. Which, speaking of naps, leads us ever so gently onward, to a silkier chapter of celebration. Snow, rare as a polite samurai in a tavern brawl, occasionally dusted the tiled rooftops of Yokohama in the late 1800s, giving the port town a fleeting illusion of a postcard Christmas. The sea mist mingled with chimney smoke, blending the foreign and the familiar, as if the city itself were a cup of miso soup, seasoned with nutmeg for reasons still unclear. By this time, Western merchants had trundled into Japanese harbors like tipsy uncles at a wedding, uninvited but impossible to ignore. Among their baggage, clocks that struck, alcohol that burned, and of course, Christmas. It came ashore not with sleigh bells, but with ledger books, hymnals, and garishly dyed wool socks. Around 1870, the first real whispers of Christmas began to hum softly through the foreign settlement of Yokohama. Shopkeepers with names like Dietz or Alexander hung holly sprigs in their windows, startling the local cats and confusing passing Buddhist monks. The Japanese, ever observant and politely baffled, watched as their new neighbors worshipped pine trees indoors and exchanged wrapped boxes with expressions of immense relief and mild obligation. It was, however, the children of the foreign settlements who championed Christmas most enthusiastically. Reports exist of small groups putting on impromptu nativity plays, using borrowed tea towels, and a suspiciously jolly schoolteacher dressed in red, who may or may not have put on the beard just to get out of grading homework. Japanese children, some the offspring of mixed families, looked on with curiosity, drawn in by the bright decorations and the irresistible allure of sweet things imported from places with names that sounded made up, like Manchester and Milwaukee. Of course, the real breakthrough didn't come from theology or the holiday spirit. It came from capitalism. Japanese merchants, with brows furrowed and abacuses clicking, noticed a peculiar pattern. Foreigners were spending a lot of money on things that no one actually needed. Colored candles, glittering ornaments, champagne, imported at hideous expense, and no better for pairing with rice crackers than it was with sashimi. In the 1880s, enterprising retailers in Tokyo started softly experimenting. There, nestled between scrolls and silks, one might suddenly find a toy trumpet or a wax angel with a vaguely startled expression. Some department stores offered curious window displays, one memorably featuring a Christmas tree flanked by 2 papier-mâché tanuki, as if trying to stage a festive showdown between folklore and fir trees. And let us not underestimate the seductive power of song. Missionary schools held carol services, the sounds drifting out into the quiet streets like sugar plums carried on ocean winds. Students learned to sing Silent Night in both English and increasingly inventive Japanese versions. There were, reportedly, schools where "O Come All Ye Faithful" was sung so earnestly over the smell of miso that neighbors came simply to stare and sip tea while trying to locate this mysterious Bethlehem on their maps. Christian converts, still quite rare, approached the season with an intimate solemnity not always shared by their merrier Western neighbours. While a Scottish trader might toast the day with hot toddy and a woolen waistcoat too tight from roast goose, a Japanese Christian might gather with a tiny congregation by candlelight, singing quiet hymns and reflecting over bento boxes lovingly packed with pickled daikon and dreams of peace on earth. But here's where history quietly plays its most unexpected card. In the flickering candlelight of curiosity, Japan began turning Christmas into something new. Not entirely Western, not entirely Japanese. A dreamlike festival some embraced, others ignored, and a few stoically monetized with the discipline of a kabuki actor reciting Shakespeare in German, which, given the Meiji-Era's fondness for all things foreign, was not an entirely implausible cultural collision. As we leave behind the candlelit classrooms and gingerbread experiments of Meiji-Era port towns, we drift northward toward a surprising twist, a touch of sweetness, convenience and poultry that would rise to define Christmas in Japan in a most unlikely way. Somewhere in the flickering candlelight of late 19th century Japan, amid the shadows of bustling port cities and the slow exhale of tea kettles, a curious thing began to glow: Christmas trees. Yes, actual fir trees, as pine-scented and needle-laden as their Western counterparts, began to appear in the oddest of places: department store windows, foreign embassies, and even more daringly, the foyers of upper-class Japanese homes. Now, this wasn't because Japan suddenly fell head over heels for tinsel and figgy pudding. No, it had more to do with a certain fondness for the novelty of the season, the sheer visual spectacle of it all. The Meiji-Era, after all, had opened a floodgate of Western ideas, customs, and decorative eccentricities, like trees you bring indoors and then cover with glass orbs and the occasional inexplicably small drum. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. While the average farmer in Hokkaido may not have decked his tatami with holly or sung carols to his udon, places like Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki became the testing grounds for Christmas curiosities. Here, foreign merchants, British, Dutch, American, and even German, had settled with their cultural baggage in tow, including the habit of celebrating a Germanic holiday in eclectic and increasingly flamboyant style. Thus, Japanese passers-by might have stared through a frosty window into a merchant's house, utterly transfixed by the glowing warmth of a ceiling-tall Christmas tree inside. Some believed it was a shrine to strange Western deities. Others probably just thought these Western folk had seasonal foliage problems. And yet, the tree had a certain charm. Enterprises like Meiji Department Store, ever ready to pounce on a trend that might involve mass-producing anything, began setting up elaborate Christmas displays. And with them came trees, bright, glittering pine pyramids dressed in imported baubles, and perhaps watched over by a cardboard cherub with suspiciously Scottish cheekbones. Now here's where things take a particularly delightful turn. As Christmas trees began to worm their way into the upper crust of Japanese society, there emerged an unexpected hero in their story: the German community. The Germans had long held a passionate relationship with the Christmas tree. If you imagine stern-looking men in starched uniforms carefully fluffing pine branches according to ancient Yule algorithms, you're not too far off. German missionaries and educators shared tales of the Weihnachtsbaum and its piney glories. Some even set about crafting tiny trees for school displays, complete with gingerbread men stiffly saluting from their sugary garlands. It quickly became apparent that, like the kimono-clad Santa we met earlier, the Japanese public was incredibly adept at reimagining traditions and turning them into something uniquely their own. Soon, enterprising souls began creating origami ornaments inspired by cherry blossoms and cranes. Paper fans might dangle from the spruce branches. Some trees glimmered with delicate lanterns instead of electric lights, flickering gently like fireflies under a starless Edo sky. And yes, more than one pine was known to sport an actual rice cake or three. By the early 1900s, the Christmas tree had found a foothold in the imagination, if not quite yet in every household. There were even government buildings that, in a flourish of diplomatic quirk, installed a tree or two, if only to keep visiting ambassadors from despairing. After all, there's nothing sadder than a German diplomat without his Tannenbaum. Still, it's important to remember that these were not yet trees of religious devotion. For most Japanese people, they served as symbols of cosmopolitan curiosity, like top hats or telegraph wires, something from over there being gazed at over here. And yet, through all the paper streamers and shake cups subtly tucked under tree skirts, one thing was clear: the tree had taken root. Not in soil, perhaps, but in hearts curious enough to wonder. As the paper cranes swayed and glass baubles caught the flicker of oil lamps, Japan's budding love affair with Christmas trees marked yet another quiet harmonization between East and West, pine and plum blossom, sleigh bells and shamisen strings. It makes you wonder what else might have taken bloom in that strangely festive compost of cultures. And speaking of bloom, the next curiosity drifting over from the West was something that didn't quite involve trees at all, but rather a mysterious red-wrapped confection that truthfully has more to do with declarations of affection than with jolly winter saints. But we'll unwrap that ever so gently next. By the 1870s, the whispers of Christmas that had tiptoed through foreign merchant enclaves and embassy walls began to stretch gently into Japanese popular culture. Like the scent of cinnamon wafting from a strange but oddly enticing kitchen, none of the local residents were quite sure they wanted to enter. The Meiji Restoration had already flung open many windows to the Western world, and with it came frock coats, pocket watches, confusing handshake etiquette, and, yes, holiday merriment with a strange red-suited man who liked chimneys and mince pies. Picture Tokyo, or rather Edo, freshly renamed and eager to impress. Not yet the illuminated urban sprawl it would become, but still sprightly with new ideas. Shops along Ginza Street flickered with gas lamps and advertisements in a curious mixture of kanji and crooked Western letters. And in December, some of the boldest shopkeepers began arranging small window displays with imported Christmas, cards, tin ornaments, and European fabric dolls wearing what must have looked like highly inefficient snow attire. Children peered into the windows with wide eyes, marveling at porcelain angels and glossy toy drums that bore no resemblance to a taiko. Mothers, clutching coin purses and silk sleeves, whispered about these new Western traditions. Were they religious, as some said, or just another product, like butter and soap and shoes that squeaked? Japanese department stores were quick to recognize a good commercial opportunity when they saw one. After all, Western holidays were less about theology and more about trinkets at this stage. By the late 1880s, stores like Mitsukoshi weren't just importing Christmas cheer. They were importing St. Nicholas himself, albeit in papier-mâché form. Dressed in what shopkeepers described as European hunting attire, a generous assumption, Santa Claus began to appear in displays, usually surrounded by snowflakes made of rice paper and watched over by curious customers holding very un-Christmas-like items such as pickled radish or a box of udon. Naturally, all of this required a little improvisation. After all, there were no family memories of roasting chestnuts by a fire. People in Japan tended to heat their homes with charcoal braziers and didn't go in for random nut combustion. Nor were there childhood stories of Santa Claus shimmying silently down non-existent chimneys, as most houses had sliding doors and few opportunities for rooftop parkour. But that didn't stop the spread of this curious Western ritual. If anything, it inspired creativity. Cookies were replaced by manju. Twinkling carols gave way to shakuhachi renditions of Silent Night, played at a gentle tempo that had more in common with a frog's yawn than heavenly hosts singing. And dinner. Rather than roast goose or stuffing, Japanese families experimenting with Christmas suppers leaned on what they had. Fish cakes, simmered vegetables, maybe even a celebratory sukiyaki if the budget allowed. Interestingly, gift-giving wasn't as foreign a concept as one might assume. Japan had, and still has, a strong tradition of omiyage and seasonal gifting, usually involving elaborately wrapped sweets, regional specialties, or commemorative towels no one particularly needs, but is too polite not to accept. Christmas, then, simply added a layer of sparkly confusion. Gifts given not because you went on a trip to Kyoto, but because a European saint/toy maker said so. Teachers found themselves in awkward positions, asked by pupils why foreigners sometimes put trees inside their homes and decorate them with shiny things, yet still considered it rude to wear shoes indoors. It's a cultural thing, some probably mumbled, adjusting their Meiji-Era moustaches and wondering if the West was actively trying to confuse everyone on purpose. Still, the idea of a winter holiday filled with light, kindness, and possibly cake was a surprisingly easy sell. Even if few people fully understood the origin story, Christmas began to slip deeper into the cultural cracks, especially among the youth, who were particularly susceptible to cake-related holidays. High school girls in Hakama skirts might gather to exchange sweet buns and sing a few borrowed carols with lyrics they didn't quite understand, but delivered with remarkable sincerity. Young men in Western suits posed rather stiffly for photographs beside tinsel-laden pines, while trying not to look too excited about the champagne biscuits someone had procured from a foreign import shop. And slowly, so very slowly, a Japanese version of Western Christmas began to bloom. Not identical, not wholly accurate, but festive in spirit and tinged with that unmistakable mood of winter transformation. much like imported poinsettias placed lovingly into tammy-lined rooms, slightly out of place, decidedly beautiful. But the most surprising transformation wasn't in the gifts or the glittering trees. It lay in what happened next, as Christmas became less foreign, less theological, and more romantic. And that, dear listener, may lead us down a curious snow-lined path of red roses, love letters, and Colonel Sanders. But we're getting just a little ahead of ourselves. Let's gently place our candle by the window and wander forward into that story, slowly. On a quiet December evening in 1887, as cold mists curled like sleepy cats along the narrow streets of Yokohama, an unusual sight could be glimpsed through thin slatted wooden shop doors and the frosted glass of Western-style cafes. It was a Christmas tree. Well, sort of. A pine sapling, slightly uneven, decorated with paper cranes, flickering lanterns, and what may or may not have been a single confused persimmon. There was no snowman outside, but a rather determined merchant named Kobayashi-san had arranged a small mound of salt in the vague shape of a foreign-looking ghost. It was a work in progress. By the late 1880s, Japan was fully motoring its way through the Meiji-Era, a national metamorphosis best described as Victorian England, but with more lacquerware and significantly better tea. The recent embrace of all things Western had left the country intrigued and a little bewildered, and Christmas, with its odd rituals involving socks hung by fire, rotund men in red, and mysterious flying reindeer, had begun to make its tentative entrance. Foreigners residing in treaty ports like Kobe, Nagasaki, and Yokohama had originally celebrated Christmas among their own small communities. Their shops imported cards from London, plum pudding from Liverpool, and questionable mechanical toys that twitched ominously thanks to early springs and ambition. To the Japanese locals, these items seemed halfway between charming and slightly alarming. But curiosity is its own kind of sleigh, and soon many Japanese companies ventured into festive commerce. Which is to say, they began selling things featuring mistletoe, even though no one could fully explain why strangers should kiss in doorways under a hanging plant. Department stores like Mitsukoshi, still young and stylish in their own way, took to the holiday with gusto by the 1890s. Fancy European window displays were replicated with a delightful level of misunderstanding. One memorable display had a reindeer wearing a kabuto helmet and dragging a sleigh filled not with presents, but with raw daikon radishes. Still, it caught the eye. At the heart of this cautious Christmas curiosity was the cake, not the fruitcake of yonder England, dense enough to be weaponized, nor the American-style log cake, which appeared to the Japanese as confusingly bark-shaped and unappetizing. No, what caught on was the sponge cake, fluffy, white, topped with sugared strawberries and heavy whipped cream. It was festive. It was red and white, a symbolically lucky color combination in Japan. And most importantly, it tasted delightful with green tea. By 1889, Western-style bakeries like Fujiya had begun handling Christmas orders, although advertising was still minimal. Tokyoites, who could afford such luxuries, began to order Christmas cake not out of religious observance, but because, to put it academically, it was adorable and delicious. Santa Claus, still a stranger in this land, occasionally appeared on imported cards, but often looked more like a friendly wizard who'd taken a wrong turn en route to a kabuki performance. Japanese school children, attending mission schools often run by foreign educators, were among the first to experience the Christmas pageant. These held miniature nativity scenes, much confusion over the livestock situation in a Bethlehem stable, and enthusiastic renditions of Silent Night sung with such passion that no one cared about melodic accuracy. Sometimes the baby Jesus doll was replaced with a daruma, accidentally, or perhaps just to keep things balanced. One touching tale comes from a school in Nagasaki, where a tiny audience of parents, bundled in wool and squinting with mild bafflement, watched as local children in makeshift robes reenacted the story of the three wise men, except they arrived on toy rickshaws rather than camels, and one had swapped frankincense for soy sauce, which ironically delighted the audience far more. The Meiji government, despite its focus on modernizing and westernizing, mostly ignored Christmas officially. It didn't become a national holiday. No surprise, since the event held no Shinto or Buddhist alignment. But there's something quietly poetic in how the holiday trickled in. Not by decree, but by bakery display, department store glitz, and the gentle suggestion of sparkling pine and sponge cake. So as December evenings grew colder in late 19th century Japan, the flicker of Western fairy lights, or their oiled lantern equivalents, began to dance behind paper windows. Christmas in Japan was not religious, nor fully traditional, but it was becoming something quietly its own, a reflection of curiosity, sweetness, and, of course, whipped cream. And while Santa's sleigh had yet to find its optimal landing spot among tiled rooftops, the sleigh bells, or at least the temple bells, gently echoed through alleyways, hinting at the quiet preparations still nestled ahead. The snow had long melted from the rooftops of Yokohama, but in one peculiar corner of the city, an area known charmingly as the Foreign Settlement, where English tea met Japanese lacquerware, December was stirring up its usual confusion. Confusion, of course, being a bit of a seasonal tradition when it came to Christmas in 19th century Japan. By the 1870s, Christmas had established itself among certain circles in Japan, not as a religious observance, but rather as an enthusiastic exercise in seasonal curiosity. Foreign diplomats, merchants, and missionaries clung to their tinsel traditions like children with sticky mittens. The locals, for their part, oscillated between bemusement and cautious participation, particularly if it involved cake. Which brings us neatly to what may be one of the most underestimated forces behind Japan's early flirtation with the holiday: the whisper-soft, cream-layered marvel known as the Christmas cake. No, not the dense, raisin-stuffed brick that haunts British dessert tables. Japan had its own style by the late 1800s, elegant, spongy, and topped with strawberries so bright they would have made Mrs. Claus blush. The appearance of these sweets during the Meiji period wasn't just an indulgence, it was a symbol. Westernization, you see, was as much about adopting constitutional monarchies and ironclads as it was about adopting frosted pastries. And it wasn't just the desserts. Western-style department stores were beginning to bloom in Tokyo and Yokohama like lanterns lining a snowy path. The Mitsukoshi department store, originally a kimono shop, began transforming into something vaguely Parisian, complete with Christmas window displays, albeit with somewhat accidental interpretations of Santa Claus, who was often drawn to look like a bearded Dutch sea captain with a tea kettle. Many of the Japanese, encountering Saint Nick for the first time, approached him with the politeness and slight suspicion one usually reserved for neighbor cats who suddenly learn to open doors, the red suit, the penchant for entering through chimneys, an architectural rarity in Japanese homes, and the ho-ho-hoing. All of it seemed deeply mysterious. Foreign children squealed in delight. Japanese children, meanwhile, eyed the proceedings cautiously while clutching their New Year's rice cakes. Still, the country's westernizing youth, those caught in the tide of Meiji Enlightenment found novelty in this borrowed holly-laced holiday. Schoolboys in sailor uniforms wrote letters to Santa-san, unsure where to send them. Some ended up in the post office. A few made it into the fireplace. One was reportedly tucked seriously into the sleeve of a passing Buddhist monk, who, years later, claimed it as the beginning of an annual sock collection. Among the foreign families, Christmas parties bubbled with energy and a touch of homesickness. There was caroling in 5 languages, plum pudding dramatically lit on fire, and awkward gift exchanges that resulted in more teapots than anyone wanted to admit. Shinto neighbors would stop by, bringing persimmons and politely attempting to guess the lyrics of Silent Night. "It's about sleep," they would ask. Sleep and cattle. On Christmas Eve, ship bells echoed gently across Yokohama Bay, blending harmoniously with the sounds of geta shoes against frosty paths and the soft rustle of norin curtains at the entryways to izakayas. Within warm rooms, oil lamps flickered like low-hanging stars. Chimneys may have been few, but even so, socks, usually tabi, were sometimes hung up, just in case the foreign magic worked better when humoured. Perhaps the most charming contradiction was that while December 25th held little official significance, the growing embrace of aesthetic merriment, light-strung trees, ribboned envelopes, and mysterious bearded men began sprinkling an undeniably Christmas-like spirit across the country. It was, in a sense, a season slowly being unwrapped by hand, layer by curious layer. And so, as the Meiji-Era marched into modernity with giddy steps and careful bows, Japan found itself neither entirely embracing nor dismissing Christmas, but rather peering at it as one might peer at a snow globe. Distant, curious, occasionally delightful, and undeniably shaken by foreigners. Outside, the wind curled along the tiled eaves, whispering its own seasonal tale, one that was being rewritten with every flicker of western pine, every misplaced carol lyric, every strawberry atop a sponge cake. And just beyond the softly steaming teacups and merry scribbles of Merry Kurisumasu, something else stirred in the quiet December air. Something wrapped, waiting, like a final thought in a dream just before waking. And so, with snowflakes melting quietly on centuries-old rooftops and the scent of pine tiptoeing around corners of a country, still deciding whether Christmas was about candles or carp, we find ourselves in the waning twilight of our tale. By the end of the 1800s, Japan had begun to hum with the low buzz of electric lights and rising Western eccentricities. Christmas, still not an official holiday nor fully understood, had taken on a curious second life among merchants, shopkeepers, and the mildly confused. Department stores, newly born marvels like Mitsukoshi and Takashimaya, started experimenting with this Western festival as a seasonal marketing opportunity. So instead of Silent Night, you got Sales Night, complete with enormous imported fir trees, excessive bunting, and store clerks in awkwardly cheerful Santa suits. Santa Claus, by the way, was rarely consistent in those early appearances. Sometimes he was depicted as an odd fusion of Daikoku, the Shinto god of wealth, and a European bishop. Other times, he resembled a heavily bearded baseball umpire in a kimono. Yet no one seemed particularly upset about it. After all, this was a country that admired seasonal change and beautiful chaos. Christmas fit right in. It helped that December in Japan was already a season of rituals. Families scrubbed their homes top to bottom in preparation for the new year. Windows washed, tatami mats aired out, bonsai trees gently judged. Workplaces would shut their sliding doors with a collective exhale, and people started giving year-end gifts known as osebo. Pre-Christmas, if you squint. These gifts weren't left under a tree, but delivered personally, sometimes with apologies for whatever happened in August. Imagine mixing Secret Santa with corporate diplomacy. And while rural villages still followed the rhythms of snow and rice storage, larger cities, Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, glowed slightly warmer during the season. Restaurants offered simple, misunderstood versions of a Western Christmas meal, which often involved sponge cake topped with strawberries, because nothing says nativity like whipped cream. Now, the idea of eating chicken, roasted, fried, or imagined, entered the Christmas lexicon. Though KFC would not launch its legendary Christmas campaign until 1974, the seeds of poultry-based holiday confusion were quietly germinating. Foreigners living in treaty port communities like Kobe and Yokohama carried on their Christmas traditions with minimal interference. It was not abnormal to see an English governess hanging mistletoe in a villa, a German baker nervously explaining stolen to his skeptical neighbors, or an American missionary trying valiantly to deliver a nativity pageant, while local school children studied him like a bilingual riddle with facial hair. There were carols sung, albeit often politely ignored by passers-by. There were even a few evergreen trees dragged up steep hills purely in the name of aesthetics. Meanwhile, Japanese Christians, a tiny minority who had returned to public worship after centuries in secret, were quietly celebrating the meaning of the holiday. In chapels and homes tucked discreetly into city grids, hymns were sung, candles lit, and prayers whispered under paper lanterns. These quietly devoted Christmases likely had more sincerity than any 1,000-foot department store display of tinsel and imported reindeer figurines. But both truths coexisted, as they often do in Japan. By the century's end, Emperor Meiji was well into his westernization campaign. He, like the country he led, wore a frock coat over tradition, unsure whether it fit or if perhaps it itched behind the collar. The Meiji government neither forbade nor encouraged Christmas. It was simply another foreign curiosity like billiards or beef stew. And much like billiards, Christmas lodged itself into Japanese culture in a way no one could have quite planned. So there, at the ragged edge of the 1800s, Christmas in Japan stood humble but persistent. Not a national celebration, certainly not a religious directive, but a twinkle, soft and strange, that reflected off polished gaiter and flickering gas lamps. A holiday reinterpreted by a nation that has always mastered the art of adaptation, folding the outside world in quietly like origami. With the night now hushed and history drowsing gently in the corners of your mind, may your dreams drift like flakes over a Tokyo street, where tin bells ring in the faint breeze and sponge cake sits patiently next to a single hopeful candle. No sleighs, no chimney, but perhaps, just perhaps, a strange, quiet kind of peace. Sleep well now, traveller. The snow has stopped. The lanterns are dim, and Christmas in Meiji Japan has drawn its quiet breath beneath the stars.